My name is Shamila Ramasamy. I am a senior counsel here at the World Bank. I'm a capital markets lawyer by training, so it's a bit of an odd segue into what we're discussing today in terms of liability risk management. But what I cover here at the World Bank really does sort of intersect with pandemic financing, and that's how I came to sort of be really involved in these issues here at the World Bank during the pandemic. I work on innovative financing, and I'm also the lead lawyer for the International Development Association, or IDA. And so as part of both of those portfolios, I was really sort of in the thick of things here at the World Bank during our COVID-19 response activities here in Washington, D.C. So it's great to be here again, and thanks again to the organizers for inviting me. So today, what I hope to do in my brief session, and I'm going to try to keep it very brief, and I don't have the excellent slides that John had, I'm afraid, so you'll have to sort of deal with this this base throughout the session. What I'm going to try and cover very briefly is just to give you a perspective of a multilateral financier as we were trying to support our member countries during the thick of things, purchasing of vaccines right at the height of the pandemic. Now, it's a small slot for a big topic, so I'm going to try to be, very brief, and it'll be very condensed, unfortunately, so happy to take questions later or offline. So during the session, I'm going to try and cover just three aspects, touching very briefly, again, on liability risk management in the context of the pandemic. And then secondly, I'll try to sort of share some experiences and observations of the bank as we supported countries in their COVID-19 vaccine purchasing, but also countries that were specifically financed and supported by the bank in those activities. And then lastly, I'll try to touch upon briefly on what we should be thinking about going forward. And with that, a little bit of a caveat, I have not been involved in the WHO discussions on Article 15 that are ongoing. So this is really just a set of observations and a perspective for my experience during the pandemic itself, all through the lens, of course, of equitable access to vaccines, because that's really something that I took away personally from our work at the World Bank during the pandemic. What we experienced really was that, and then this is to give the upshot of my little talk away somewhat, but really the experience that we had was liability risk management issues really did play a very strong role in restricting equitable access to vaccines for lower middle income countries. And so with that, let me try to sort of kick off, firstly, setting the scene for risk allocation. Now, John talked about this in a lot more detail earlier, but just to sort of summarize, risks appear throughout the vaccine process, delivery, distribution, administration, and also after administration. And the key risks include serious adverse effects from the vaccine, allegations of negligent vaccine distribution or manufacturing or design defect claims. And now, no one mechanism can eliminate risk entirely. There are a number of instruments in the toolkit, especially here at the bank as well. There are contractual provisions, indemnification provisions, domestic legislation that countries employ, including the establishment of no-fault compensation mechanisms. And lastly, countries also put in place financial backstops, so funding liability obligations. And all of these can operate to allocate risk more equally amongst participants, both purchasers and sellers. But really what we experienced here at the bank was that the pandemic was an unprecedented event on so many levels for all of us. I'm sure we all experienced this personally. But in the context of the scale and the speed of vaccine research, development, production, and deployment, that's one of the sort of unprecedented elements that really sort of impacted liability risk management as a whole. It created the perfect storm of coupling extreme demand, which outstripped supply at incredible pace. And that really did sort of translate to an ecosystem for borrowers and IBRD and IDA borrowers, but also specifically countries, lower middle income countries, where there was a disruption in the balance of more traditional risk sharing in vaccine procurement and financing. So the key takeaway from our experience really was that at the height of the pandemic, the balance of power was skewed in favor of the private sector and vaccine manufacturers. So not only did countries urgently need vaccines to mitigate their public health crisis, but demand for vaccines far outstripped supply. And this sort of ties into something John was talking about earlier, which is the worst time really to start negotiating and thinking about how to manage liability risk in the context of vaccine production, supply, distribution, administration is during a pandemic, because of this perfect storm where you do have demand for vaccines outstripping supply. So with all that, moving on to the second aspect and second sort of section of my presentation, what was our experience more specifically? So the World Bank during the pandemic was helping developing countries strengthen their pandemic response, increase disease surveillance, and improve public health interventions generally. And what we delivered in the end was an unprecedented $204 billion financial support at the height of the pandemic, of which $135 billion came from IDA and IBRD, and $60 billion from IFC and $9 billion from MEGA. Now, our project supported a range of activities, including most importantly, obviously, the support for countries to purchase or deploy COVID vaccines. But our projects also had components that were far-reaching beyond vaccines, included restructuring, redeployment, and reallocation of existing resources, and a lot of sort of ancillary pandemic response and economic shocks, trying to sort of address some of the economic shocks that countries faced as well. So sort of far-reaching beyond vaccine deployment. So with that lens, what we were able to sort of see is that, we as a multilateral were helpful in some respects in sort of supporting countries' recovery, but we were also able to facilitate risk allocation and liability risk management and somewhat encourage international best practices. And I think you saw earlier from John's summary, the really sort of tough, hard work that WHO, CEPI, Gavi, COVAX, UNICEF, everybody played in actually developing a strategy and framework for liability risk management that our member countries could also deploy during the pandemic. At the World Bank as well, we were assisting member countries in our own way, assisting them with procurement and reviewing arrangements of their procurement activities, providing technical assistance and training on these subjects. Now, what was our client country experience in the end? Fundamentally, the general gist of our client country's experience was that they were caught between a proverbial rock and a hard place for most of the low middle-income countries. The urgency of the situation placed both borrower and MDB lenders like the World Bank in a challenging position, because we were not only needing to negotiate pricing, but we are also needing to consider liability for various risks. And liability and risk management negotiations were complex for borrowing countries in particular, lower middle income countries. What countries had to do was they had to face with two things. They had to grapple with, firstly, different requirements on liability and indemnification provisions from different purchasing mechanisms. Again, remember, during the height of the pandemic, countries had multiple avenues, and particularly lower middle income countries had multiple avenues to access vaccines. That didn't mean that it translated to equitable access to vaccines, unfortunately. But what it did mean was that there were different requirements placed on them to meet with liability and risk requirements and management requirements. So for instance, COVAX, AVAT had a whole set of requirements, bilateral deals, which countries were entering into directly with manufacturers had a whole set of different requirements. And this did sort of create a imbalanced landscape. But it also was a shifting landscape, because what countries faced as well was, once they'd entered into initial contractual terms with manufacturers, sometimes even through purchasing platforms like COVAX, additional requirements were placed on them based on additional due diligence that manufacturers were undertaking in respect of how best to deliver vaccines in the particular climate. So you had different requirements, and then you had shifting landscape of requirements. And so what this meant was countries were having to really react very quickly and nimbly, and through the support of the organizations that John listed out earlier, COVAX, CEPI, AVAT, Gavi, UNICEF, they did manage to respond as best as they could at the height of the pandemic. But again, the height of the pandemic is not the most ideal to try to deal with shifting landscapes and different requirements. So there's a range of country reactions ultimately, and it all really drilled down to different local legislative frameworks already in place. So for example, some jurisdictions had constitutional or legislative restrictions on offering indemnities. And then some other countries were able to adapt very quickly. For example, Colombia, Philippines, Lebanon were able to adopt laws providing immunity to manufacturers, something that John touched upon earlier briefly as well. So some other situations as well, which we found were equally daunting, where manufacturing contracts included financial restrictions, for instance. So countries were required to provide forms of financial backstop, for instance, general liability insurance. But what is the key takeaway from all of these experiences of countries? The basic principle here is that countries had to get to grips very quickly with the shifting landscape of indemnification and liability issues. And ultimately, this resulted in additional barriers to engagement and delayed access to vaccines, which comes back to the main topic of this event, which is equitable access to vaccines. So I think I'll finish off by saying, one of the main takeaways from the World Bank's experience is that legal preparedness is an important aspect for countries as we now operate in non-pandemic times, to make sure that we build robust systems for risk management and planning before an emergencies. It's essential because it includes building capacity on the ground and assessment of legislative frameworks. These are all necessary due diligence that should be conducted ahead of time, so that we establish strong equitable relationships with third parties well ahead of being caught in the maelstrom and having to deal with them on the go when the balance of when the negotiating balance is way off and skewed. So I'll pause there and say thank you again.